Welcome, everybody, to the Rebels by Design Wrestling Podcast, brought to you by HustleJet ENT. I am your host, Steiner Recliner 83, and you're listening to episode number 19. And on this episode, we're going to talk about what are some of the most greatest returns in professional wrestling. And being that we are just hot off of a recent major return to wrestling a couple weeks ago, the first official match I've heard was last night of this recording. We're talking about AJ Lee. But before we get into today's topic, there's a couple things I want to address first and foremost. I know it's been a long time since I put out an episode, in almost 2 months. So I know a lot of you probably thinking, is the podcast over with? Did I decide to give up on it? The answer to that was no. The real reason is that the last couple of months has been kind of hectic for me in the real life world that has kind of prevented me to be able to sit down and record episodes. And I did not ever intend to be as long as it has. But here we are. But I do want to appreciate all the support that we have got on all over the different social media platforms that this podcast is on. Even though we're still a small podcast that's slowly but surely is growing, I truly appreciate all the support and all the people who have watched or listened to this podcast. As of this morning, again, small numbers, and I truly appreciate seeing these kind of numbers. This morning of the recording of this podcast, we reached the first 50 download on Buzzsport, which means of audio, and the average viewers on YouTube has been very consistent and slowly but surely growing. And again, I truly appreciate all the support, all the people who have watched or listened, depending where you got the podcast from. And I do plan on continuing to do this podcast as long as I can, so. Being that, it's been almost 2 months, and I know a lot of people kind of wondering what happened and kind of wondering, is it done or is it not? I don't plan on giving up on this podcast. I don't plan on stopping the podcast either. I just had things going on in my personal life that left me not having the time to record a podcast and do everything it takes to do. You have to keep in mind with me, it is a one-man show when it comes to what I do. I recorded it, I edit it, I the only one that's talking, so it's a lot of work that goes into it, and especially when you're trying to be consistent on how long each episode is, which is, tend to try to be close to about an hour-ish, but it also depends on if there's a guest or not, which I am trying to work on getting back into that as well, especially for the next episode being number 20. I want to do that one fairly big. So, I got my work cut out. Plus, with hockey season going on, which is another big passion of mine, that's starting up in a couple weeks, the regular season. So, that's also going to be factored into my time. So, going to be working around that. So, the main thing is trying to get back on track and be back with a consistent schedule again. And I was doing a whole bi-weekly thing, and that was working out fairly well for quite some time. But then things happened. A lot of it is job related, getting extra busy, being more worn out and tired is kind of the main reason behind it. I won't get into too much details on that because this is not what you're here for. But I do want to apologize for the lack of episodes coming out and the long delay, first and foremost. But I do want to thank everybody who has watched or listened to this podcast since the beginning and getting to where we're at now with number 19. But I want to get that out there first before I dive into today's topic. So, and this topic kind of came to me due to some comments I saw on social media, and then it had me really think about the last several years of major returns in professional wrestling, and then had me think about, okay, where do they actually do rank, in my opinion? So this coming off the return of AJ Lee a couple weeks ago, who had her first match as of this recording last night in a mixed tag match at WrestlePalooza, teaming up with her husband CM Punk, taking on Seth Rollins and Becky Lynch. Going into this match, there were a couple people on social media who said the return of AJ Lee was, I quote, the biggest return in professional wrestling history. Which that statement alone is a lot to process, because that's one of those things I look back like, is it really that high? It had me think about that for a minute, you know? And of course, you're going to break down and start reflecting on all the other returns in professional wrestling. And think about how monumental that was and so forth. So I'm looking back on it and going, okay, I don't feel the same way. Now, keep in mind, as I rank them in order, I will say she's up there. She definitely is up there, but I don't think she's the biggest of all time. So that's a huge statement to make on any return, but I don't feel that way. So I want to talk about who I think, So it was hard. I can't just do like a top 10 or anything like that, because it's kind of like, it's hard because the lower half of the tier kind of gets kind of jumbled up. Um, to me anyway, but I consider and go starting with number one. Uh, I would say the number one biggest return in wrestling history would had to been the return of Edge. At the 2020 Royal Rumble, because he was gone for for nearly a decade, first and foremost, and he had the kind of injury that nobody saw any possibility that he could actually return from, and from how he retired and having triple neck fusion surgery, which is a major thing, because you know most people after number one, a lot of people have returned from one surgery, but to have it done two more times, it's really a high risk, So to me, because it was because of the situation and nobody saw it coming, I would put him higher, because that was such a very emotional return that nobody saw coming. Um, and it was more of a secret in a better way, and AJ Lee was kind of not that. It was clearly one of those obvious things, like I call it one of the worst kept secret situations. Um, but again, I felt like Edge was more important, a bigger deal. Okay, because I look at injuries that are, there's no way that person was going to return. That kind of situation. Now AJ Lee did have an injury that was on the borderline of that seriousness, but I want to get into the other one. But I'm talking about when you think about the injury itself and how big of a star that person is. You kind of have to find that balance. To me, that's how I look at it, and I felt like Edge is somebody who has headlined at WrestleMania more than one time, had one of the most decorated careers in WWE history, and what he, in the moments that he has brought to, in the moments that he brought, to WWE history, I just feel like he was a much more bigger return to the ring than the ring. So that's why I feel like he, to me, would be my number one in wrestling history. Now, it's very close up the top of the list, because the second one I will put Shawn Michaels. Because Shawn Michaels, even though it was a short period of time, but there was a lot of doubt that Shawn Michaels again would ever return to the ring from his back injury. So he was out of action for 4 years before he returned to the WWE ring. Um, and he had the kind of back injury that was very questionable. And for him to not only come back, but to have a Hall of Fame career for the second half of his career, being like, so Shawn Michaels was so good when he came back that he had two Hall of Fame wrestling careers. Because his first run, obviously, was, he held all these different champions, had all these classic matches and so forth. He was Hall of Fame worthy then. So to come back to return to wrestling after 4 years and have a second half that was just as good, if not better, than his first half. And a lot of people will say that, and I will say that, because even though the championships, wasn't as many as they were in the first half, but the quality of matches that he had in that second half, is right up there. When you talk about his return match with to the ring against Triple H, when you talk about his WrestleMania match with Kurt Angle, the triple threat matches he had with Benoit and Triple H, the countless of matches he had against just about anybody. He was Mr. WrestleMania. That label really came full effect on the second half when he stole the show with Kurt Angle. He had two amazing matches with The Undertaker. He was, it was like no matter who he's in the ring with, chances are like you're going to get the match of the night from Shawn Michaels. There were some different breeds of opponents. His stuff with Chris Jericho, again, incredible, from WrestleMania 19, and then the other feud over when Jericho did a more serious character, and so like you look at all these things in the second half of Shawn Michaels' career, like he had two Hall of Fame worthy careers in his run with the break in the middle, yeah, he had a world title for a month, and he had a couple tag title runs, but like, even though the championship belts weren't as many as he in the first half, it was just the quality of match and how good he was telling amazing stories in the ring that no one didn't really truly knew what they were to get out of Shawn when he came back, because it looked like, because first I started like, oh, maybe he's a one and done, or he's going to come here and there, but then all of a sudden he went from having a match every couple months to all of a sudden he was there every single week. Then he became a regular, and the back injury became a second thought, that like as if it didn't really happen, And that's what makes it so incredible. And being that Shawn Michaels was that good and such a star, and that's where I put him as number two for me. Number three is the first probably on this list of was not injury related, but it was more of a personal vendetta that we saw in what was going on with this guy that was well known. And again, when you think about such a long period of time where he was away from all of professional wrestling in general, that's when you start factoring in, like, okay, will this ever happen? That becomes the biggest question, right? So I'm combining. So I'm going to say both of these are truly impactful in both ways. I'm going to be talking about the return of CM Punk, both in AEW and his WWE return. But starting with the AEW debut, it was so fantastically done. Hometown crowd, the biggest indoor arena in Chicago, the United Center, sold out. The crowd, chanting his name from the moment the show went on the air. So like there was no choice but him be the first segment of that episode of Rampage. Drew one of the highest rankings in AEW history on television. On top of that, and for how long as CM Punk was away from wrestling in general, like he was not doing like conventions, he was not doing anything. He was focused on a MMA career. He was doing a lot of commentary for MMA shows, and like he was like you were at that point where you're believing that he was never going to ever return to for wrestling because the way he was how how he was, and then all of a sudden that year that he returned, all of a sudden we see him like kind of working out in the ring, you know, and doing these kind of throwing these subtle hints, if you will. But nobody knew for sure, and being that CM Punk is CM Punk, he loves to work people. Yeah, that's how he always been, and so like you never really truly know what was going to happen. And I know in the wrestling industry, it's always never say never, but this was one of those cases where you really was pretty much considered that, yeah, CM Punk probably not going to return to wrestling, especially as he was getting older. He was in his mid-40s, so like people were like, you know, he's at that age where like, are we sure he's ever going to wrestle again? And if he did come back, what kind of a performer would he be when he did return? That was also the other question mark, right? And when you're an aging wrestler, that you always have that question in the back of your mind, like what if even if he does return, what version of CM of that wrestler are you going to see? You had those questions, right? And with CM Punk, it was no difference to me. But not only did he come back, he was doing very well in his AEW run up until the incident happened. Which we all know that story, and that's a whole, different topic in its own. And I wasn't going to dive in deep into what all happened because we all do know what happened. But he was having outstanding matches up until that point. So basically showing that he did have plenty left in the tank, in my view. And so because of that, so that was the first part of the return of CM Punk. Now the second part is like when he returned back to WWE, which, getting Punk back to return in the wrestling period was such a monumental thing due to how CM Punk left WWE. Was another one of those situations where did he ever think it would ever happen? Became the question. Because he had issues with a lot of the people in charge. He had issues with Triple H, who was now the main guy in charge of the everyday process of WWE. He's the voice of WWE. He's the guy that they sent down everywhere to do press conferences, interviews, and whatnot. Even though he's not the most highest ranked official in WWE or TKO, we all know Nick Khan is and all that stuff, but CM Punk has been, Triple H has been that guy they put on every show, right? To discuss all of WWE's business. He's the one doing all the media work, and speaking out on behalf. You really see Nick Khan rarely does it. It's always about Triple H. He and Punk and Triple H had a lot of history that they didn't really like each other or care for each other very much. Punk had issues with Vince McMahon as well. So when you factor in those two things and the way Punk was for so long, held that grunge for so long, from the injury, the doctor issues that he had, how burned up and beat up he was, getting fired on his wedding day, and all those things that you factor in, it was one of those things that you didn't think he would ever step foot in a WWE ring ever again situation. So that return, so that's what makes that return so much special. But and again, happening on a major pay-per-view in Chicago. On top of that, nobody saw that one coming either because there's like rumors and thoughts of the possibilities that he could return after he was let go by AEW, but Nobody knew for sure, and all of a sudden, at the very last second of the show, boom, he comes out. And the crowd lost their mind. It was such a monumental and emotional moment. You see it in the eyes of a lot of the fans and CM Punk himself. And that's what makes these moments so much special when you see their own emotions get on. You know, you saw it in Edge's face. You know, and you kind of, in a moment, you saw it in Shawn Michaels' face as well. Not as noticeable as Edge or Punk, but like they felt it, you know, and those are the things that you really notice for sure. So that's why I put CM Punk in general as my number three. And I kind of put both of them there because they're both are equally very monumental for different reasons. One for the longevity of being out of professional wrestling in general, and then going back to the company that you never thought he would ever go back to. And it does, you know, bring the actual question of if AEW did never was yeah tongue title if AEW didn't ever exist to allow CM, and it makes you wonder if CM Punk would ever return to wrestling if AEW didn't exist in the first place to kind of light that fire again. That's always been a question that's back up my mind. If the kind of the what ifs and if this didn't happen, would that have happened? If CM Punk never had AEW as a platform to return to wrestling, to reignite the fire of passion about professional wrestling, and then had that fallout where a lot had become available again to the point where he decides to return to the company that he had the fallout in and go back into that locker room and, you know, bury the hatchet with a lot of people and become the more you know uh, what's the term I'm looking for? You know, modern model employee to WWE because let's face it, there had not been a single issue since he returned to WWE. So it makes you kind of wonder if it was a AEW locker room situation or was it just a more humbling situation he was in that he had endured himself, where he said, "Well, if he's going to continue to have a professional wrestling career on a big stage, he had no choice but to make that whole situation work." Makes you think about that for a minute. You don't, you know, to me, you got to think about those things now. So going on to after CM Punk, this is where it starts to get kind of okay. Lesser about longevity of being gone, and then and for reason. So after Punk, I put Bret the Hitman Hart. Bret Hart returning to a WWE event as a special guest, you know, general manager and all that stuff. I don't think anybody saw that ever taking place because Bret had and still does in a lot of ways holds his grudges on people so long. To this day, he still does it to Goldberg and Triple H mainly. And like the idea of after the Montreal Screwjob, to think that you would ever see Bret Hart on a Monday Night Raw or any other event besides obviously the Hall of Fame, that Bret Hart would have anything to do with dirty programming. That was such a huge deal that people don't realize how huge it was. Like Bret was gone for a very long time from WWE, and he spoke very ill will towards WWE for a number of years. You know, he still hated Shawn Michaels. He still hated Vince McMahon. He still hated Triple H. You know, and all these guys were still having major roles in WWE. Because at the time, Triple H was still also starting to work his way into the management part of WWE at the time. And of course, Vince was still around. And Shawn was still an active competitor on the roster. So to see Bret Hart return to WWE television and to be on Monday Night Raw, to see him hug it out with Shawn Michaels and bury the hatchet with Shawn, and that was turned out to be a legitimate bury the hatchet because afterwards they were supporting were in a way becoming friends again. And Brett was willing to work enough with Vince McMahon to even have a somewhat kind of a match. uh, with limitations and stuff like that. Bret Hart actually had a run, in the WWE. Final run, even though there was a lot of limitations and stuff like that because of the stroke and all the head trauma that he dealt with. But to even get to that point in general is such an incredible thing, And even though he still had never forgiven Triple H, he still talks ill about Triple H to this day. Same with Goldberg, for obvious reasons, and people say, "Oh, he's just bitter and he will not get over it." And it's hard to be put in the shoes of Bret Hart with Goldberg, especially when Goldberg cost him $3 million a year and had your entire wrestling career and life changed forever. It's a very tough pill to swallow. So it's hard to put yourself in those shoes when you're not dealing with it yourself. But Bret Hart returning to WWE was such a huge thing that you never expected to ever happen. So that's why I put him there. Next is where I would put AJ Lee at number 5. Because, again, AJ Lee was dealing with an injury and she was gone for a long time. And for many years, it didn't seem like she would have any real desire or didn't think she could even return to wrestling because of all her or other personal reasons that she was dealing with. When you're dealing with bipolar disorder, that's a big thing to try to overcome. And when you're dealing with that, professional wrestling, as we know, is probably one of the last things on your mind at the time. And because of the injuries that she was dealing with, because she also had a neck injury, don't think she had any kind of surgery on it. But again, the longevity of her being away from the ring, and she seemed so content on her life at that point. Put out books, doing graphic novels, and all these other things. Helping doing Glow, producing it, or the wrestling, doing a women's wrestling show and all that stuff as behind the scenes. I didn't really expect. I was very unsure if I would see that again. Of course, a lot of people were wondering if she was going to come back to when Punk returned to AEW, and if Punk stayed in AEW, you never know. You just never know. But now to see her come back and have her first match back, which she looked, she looked good in it. I didn't say it was the match of the night, the greatest match in the world, but it was very passable of a match. And she clearly was able to hang with them. That's what the more important thing is. And so to see her do come back and after the long break, and again, with how things happened after she retired from wrestling, and everything that happened with her husband, that became the question about whether she returned to WWE, or professional wrestling as we know because of her husband, being away from wrestling as we know it as well. So it's kind of one of those things where you look at that situation through that hourglass, well, Punk is out of wrestling, and for a while was very bitter about wrestling. So I'm pretty sure that AJ Lee kind of supported that for a long time and was kind of feeling the same way herself, possibly. But now it's easier to speak on it now because she's back and she had her first match. And that's one of the things that I look at when it comes to returns is, okay, after the first major moment of the return, what followed it, is the other part. And honestly, when it comes to like a major injury like this, you always have those questions, And so I had those questions to see what we were going to expect from last night, and that was going to determine like where will I rate them because yes, she definitely was a top five, top 10 uh, return in wrestling history, but I don't consider her the biggest because the people I named above her, above, I felt were more impactful, bigger stars in general than her. But I'm not saying she's not a big star because she is. But is she above the other ones I mentioned in general? That's where you kind of have to look at factor in. But definitely, she's definitely top five, and that's why I put her at number five on the list because that's where because I don't gonna put right behind you know Bret Hart, CM Punk, uh, Edge, and Shawn Michaels. You know, obviously I didn't say that in order, but it's like that's a heck of a group of people that you're in the top five. So that's where I ranked her as returns number five overall. But I can keep going, and now we're trying to dip it into more non-injury related, but just the moment itself and what it you know it's not necessarily they were on bad terms and they were never going to return. Possibility we're certain because after the top five, it kind of becomes more. They were gone for a while, and it becomes the return of the moment in itself, and we're gonna start going into that now because of this was not necessarily of a we left on bad terms or we had a serious injury that was never gonna just gonna prevent us to ever return to wrestling kind of situation. This is more they returned after a long period of being gone from one company, and the moment itself was very special. So with number six, I'm saying the return of the Hardy Boys at WrestleMania. When they were literally the Ring of Honor World Tag Team Champions and lost them to the Bucks the night before to return to WWE after a long hiatus. The moment the crowd reaction and everything just made that thing so special. As soon as that music hit after the New Day saying they're the fourth team going enter this match, this now is going to be a four-way ladder match. Out comes the Hardys. The whole stadium exploded. They exploded. And that moment, makes it, and the reaction and what they did in that match, of course, it's one of the biggest in history, in WWE history. You know, and that's something that you just gotta just take in, and especially when you're watching it live on TV, you can just tell that doesn't even remotely like everybody felt it from at home, but like imagining what the crowd being in that crowd and how that moment what it felt was probably extra special. And that's one of the reasons why I put that so high is because the whole aura of the moment was so big, and the crowd went so crazy over it. And you can tell that the heart and especially when you see the behind the scenes videos and stuff about it, like the Hardys were really, Jeff was nervous. Both of them were really, you know, so happy to be returning after all that time away, and to do it on the biggest stage you possibly could do it at WrestleMania. You put all those factors in there, it's like that was one of those, iconic moments in wrestling history that you just don't get to have very often in that manner. I mean, how many people could say they returned at WrestleMania after a long hiatus? There's not many that can say that. There's only a couple of them. Which brings me to number 7. Another man who made a return to WrestleMania to WWE at WrestleMania after a long hiatus away from WWE, and what he was doing prior to that made you think that he was never going to come back to WWE. That is one of the current faces of WWE now, Cody Rhodes. Cody left WWE because he was very frustrated of creative. Being that he was simply told all they ever wanted him to be was Stardust. Cody asked for release and took a bet on himself to say, hey, I can show everybody that I am more than this Stardust, the mid-card guy in WWE. Some people say they would be perfectly content with that, but Cody wanted to be more. He wanted to be a top guy. That's the kind of hunger that professional wrestlers should have. To want to be the top guy, not just settle for whatever role they were given. So Cody went out on the independent circuit and tried to redefine himself as a personality. Became a top guy throughout the independent circuit. Went to Japan. Became part of the biggest stables in Japan at the time. It still existed, but not quite at the level it was back then in the Bullet Club. Then he went to Ring of Honor and became world champion there. And just became a top guy throughout the independent circuit. Where a lot of people, some people have done that and became a bigger name for it. And Cody was one of those situations. Then, the one thing that made me believe that this is why a lot of people think it was never going to happen again. When he became a EVP for AEW, now jumpstart this brand new alternative wrestling company on mainstream television, on TNT, TBS. To be a part of that and be part of the management system of this company. A lot of people probably was believing that they were never going to see Cody ever again in WWE. And rightfully so when you think about it in that situation. Then something happened and Cody Rhodes' contract not only ran out, he decided to, what? AEW was no longer for him anymore. Not leaving it in bad terms, but it just felt like he had something missing in him that only, and leaving was like the only option to try to reward that, which was becoming WWE champion. And to the surprise to a lot of people, he ended up going back to WWE and taking everything he was in AEW and bringing it to WWE. The theme music, the American Nightmare, nickname and look, all those things that he was doing, he took it with him. And ended up returning at WrestleMania against Seth Rollins and becoming the face of WWE. Not only return as a top guy, but he became the guy and became the guy to dethrone Roman Reigns in a couple years. From that, after coming back from a major injury and all these things, like he became the guy. So it proved that sometimes that gamble is worth it. To come back and become a bigger name than you were when you left. And we've seen it happen before. Like Drew McIntyre was released, and he lit a fire in him, where he got himself in tremendous shape, stepped up his game in a lot of ways. Why not come back to becoming a top guy in the company? Became a world champion at one point. Still having, major matches in his career. Even though not winning as many of it as he used to, but to be put in the ring against, CM Punks and Now he just had a match with Cody last night. And having high profile matches after high profile matches compared to what he was the last time we saw him in WWE, where he was a lower tier guy, barely getting television time on Raw or SmackDown, doing a silly three man band gimmick, and then wrestling on like Superstars or Main Event or whatever the internet only shows were at the time. He left and got motivated and came back as a bigger name. Those are those are the things you look at for a wrestler that you know. As a wrestling fan, I appreciate a wrestler a lot more that's willing to make those sacrifices. When you get let go, that you go instead of just you know kicking and moaning and stomping and moaning and waiting for a W to call you back, that you decide to what I'm going to show them by going out there and busting my hump and redefine who I am. You know, Cody did that. Drew did that. Bobby Lashley did that. Lashley still had a big role in WWE when he left, but like he improved himself as a better round performer. Got better at Mike by going to TNA, and he coming back. Still a bigger deal, but even more complete. Um, like we're even seeing that right now with Tony Storm going out there and redefining her who she was. There's a few, and it happens. Matt Cardona has done very well. He's not, he's been appearing on TNA and a lot of other major wrestling promotions in the independent world consistently, whether it's NWA, TNA, or MLW and so forth. Maybe believe pro wrestling even. This guy went out there, redefined his character, became such a high enough act where he is such in high demand where he's willing to take any booking no matter where. Russell's pretty much a full time schedule without working for a major company and signing a major contract, and built himself an entire brand. From action figures to a podcast of his own. He became a businessman. And it's been very impressive to see what he's been able to do on his own. And Cody was kind of like one of the blue. Cody and Drew were kind of like the original blueprint of that doing so. Taking that bet. Say, hey, I am more than what you think I am. And so that's why I put. So Cody definitely is up there at number. Where are we at? Number 7. The Hardys was was 6, right? So we're at number 8. Number 8 to me is fine. We're kind of more going towards AEW on this one because even though he had one appearance in a Royal Rumble match like a month or two prior, I'm looking at the return of Christian Cage. Again, another guy who was out with a concussion that nobody ever thought he could come back from. And he made the Royal Rumble appearance, and everyone's like, okay, Royal Rumble appearance, not a big deal, easy to protect. But then he went to AEW, signed a contract with them. not only went there and he came back to a full time competitor in AEW and was able to have show that he still had it in the ring, that he was still an amazing performer, and became one of his best versions of his character he had in a long time. He became one of the most hated wrestlers in AEW, as a heel, and now he recently kind of transitioned into a face role, but still using the same character. Um, it's rather interesting, and it was a completely different character than he was ever playing uh, in WWE ever. You know, so it was rather interesting, and he made it work so well. And then he goes out there and still had incredible matches. Um, Again, to me, Christian, not being in that spot where like nobody ever thought he would wrestle again because of the head injury. Though he made that one Royal Rumble appearance and he ended up leaving the company, and then he goes to AEW and has been having a really good run. Um, Overall in his career, so that was another one I thought about. But like he wasn't. He had a main event, one show for the world title, but mainly been leading around a stable of younger talent. Um, it's been in his main role for most of the time he's been there, up until recently, where he reunited with Adam Copeland, aka Edge. So we're seeing the CNs, so we're seeing the Toronto boys back together again, which is also a really cool thing to see, to have that one more time. Which is one of the reasons why Cope even went to AEW in the first place, because I believe his kids want to say, "I want to see you with Uncle Jay one more time," aka Christian. His best friend for so many years, and I'm sure right now they're probably having the time of their lives with this run. Which is going to bring me to number 9. I'm going to say the return of Hulk Hogan to WWE. Not because I didn't think it would ever happen again, but it was more of the moment itself and what it meant for the company. So in 2002, Hogan and the NWO returned to WWE. After being gone since 1994, and being a part of the NWO and damn near put the company out of business, Hogan returns to the company that he helped put on the map originally with Hulkamania. And this is coming from a guy who's not even a big Hulk Hogan fan, but even with that being said, I understood what it meant for what he meant to the company in itself, and this is one of the returns where like not more that I didn't think it would ever happen again, but what having the guy who put the company on the map, what in the mainstream level that it did during the '80s with Hulkamania, I know what that meant to the company itself. To have that guy have a comeback run was truly special, and he ended up having such a memorable moment at WrestleMania 18 that year. He was able to have one more world title run for a month, short lived, but still a moment that a lot of fans would not forget, that was around that in those times and knew what Hogan meant to the company. Um, and you look at that 2002 year, and to me, it was like Hulk Hogan's last great run. I call it. Um, the 2002 to 2003 up to WrestleMania 19. That whole period of time was like we saw Hulk Hogan's last great run. You know, as Hulk. Sure he came back for one-off matches, but it wasn't exactly the same of what we saw in that period of time. That's just my opinion on that. Um, But like I said, knowing what that moment meant, you know, for the guy who helped build the WWF slash WWE, under Vince McMahon's vision, to come back after a long period of not being away, and in the circumstances that they were, where he went to WCW and Daniel put Vince out of business. Um, he kind of question, like, would he ever come back? Um, in a way. So when he did come back and had the run he did, it definitely puts him in the top 10. So now we got kind of, so we're trying to wrap up the top 10 here. Um, to round it up, I want to say, this is where it gets a little, this is where it gets more difficult, Actually, you don't. I probably should have put him higher when I think about it. Stone Cold Steve Austin's return at WrestleMania. After almost 20 years away from the ring, nobody thought he would ever have a match ever again. But to go into Texas and end up having a full on match with Kevin Owens was special. And I might think it was, the more I think about it, the more I should think he probably should have been higher up. So I might flip it with the Hardys. Uh, and kind of, so I'll probably go. So now what I think, totally blanked out for a minute here. So recapping the order again, I'm going to recap the order. One Edge, two Shawn Michaels, three CM Punk, uh, four Brett, five AJ Lee, six Austin, seven the Hardys, eight Christian, nine Hogan, and then number 10. We haven't gotten to that one yet, but I want to talk about so the Hogan return that I don't know why I just blanked out on that. The Hogan return, not Hogan return, but the Austin return. Um, Again, when you think about somebody who's been away for so long, and I don't think that he would have a match ever again at WrestleMania, and to do it in Texas at WrestleMania against Kevin Owens, um, no one really didn't know what to expect with that, because they advertised it as Austin appearing on the Kevin Owens show. It was never even advertised as a match. It was advertised as just a segment that happens to be the last thing at WrestleMania on night one. So Austin comes out, you know, and when the crowd just went nuts when he said, "I came here for a fight. Let's get a referee in here. Let's do this." And then him and Kevin Owens had a street fight brought over the arena. Austin took bumps and everything else. Whole 9 yards. Had a good 15-minute match or so. And like nobody, I just remember myself going, I didn't expect to see this again. Austin actually is having a freaking match. Like I was so caught up in that alone for so long during that match. Like I can't believe I'm watching Austin having a match. You know, it was one of those situations where like, and this is why I put him at back up at number 6 and pushed everybody else back down one notch because Austin was a big deal. Returning it, he was gone for a lot longer than everybody else on this list, and because of what injury he did have and everything he was going through, because I think he had a shoulder surgery as well, like a couple years prior to this, when he made the last appearance in Texas, WrestleMania. Um, this was a big deal. It was a very big deal that I feel embarrassed that I didn't put him in order properly in the first place. But so obviously I'm recording this, kind of live setting, but I'm not starting over. So I'm gonna, just say it as it is, and um, hopefully everybody who listens to the whole episode gets where I'm coming from. Um, but number 10 has kind of been it's a challenging which one I will put because there are a couple more I could say. Because and it's because of more of the moment itself and how crowd went nuts for it, how the crowd reacted to it. There's like three of them I'm thinking of. So I guess there's going to be a couple hour mentions. But I am going to put at number 10 the return of Triple H at Madison Square Garden in 2002. Or late 01, 02, whatever. Before he went to say he's going to the Royal Rumble. Being that it was at Madison Square Garden, Triple H was coming from an injury that nobody in wrestling had ever came back from or even had that was ever noted, which was a torn quadricep, right? So that was a interest. All of that was a new thing in wrestling. Nobody had ever had to deal with that. Nobody ever really we ever heard anything like that before. Like torn quad, like what, like how, what? Can we seen the blown out knees before? We've seen knee injuries before, but never ever really talk about that muscle being torn and how important that muscle is to your legs. And to tear off the bone like that, that was one of those situations where you gotta go, what is it we're gonna get from Triple H when he did come back? When you after the return, right? I mean, he ended up having a great run, no doubt about it. He was, the face of Raw for many years, and ended up helping establish Randy Orton, Batista, and even in a way John Cena as well. But when you think about that, the injury in itself is like it was so new to us. No one really knew what that meant, what's going to happen next with that. So for him to come back and do what he did, and rehab the heck of it, and that the whole moment when he came back at Madison Square Garden, the crowd went absolutely apeshit for it, and the crowd loved it. That was one of those. Again, you had to be their moment to really truly feel what that experience was like. Because I know watching at home, it was pretty emotional. And you may not be the biggest fan of a wrestler when they have these moments of a return like that, but like you still feel it because they went through hell to get to that point to be able to return. The Triple H is definitely there in the top, and that round up the top my top 10. So as I said, I had a couple other ones that I could consider as honorable mentions. Now, one of them was because he was gone for a few months in order to transform himself back to a different character. And again, Madison Square Garden WrestleMania 20 is where it happened. The return of the Dead Man Undertaker. After being buried alive back in November '03 by Kane and Vince McMahon and being the American Badass, the Undertaker returned as the Dead Man. The gongs, the druids, and talking about death and everything, all that returned. The moment you heard the light, you saw the druids come out, and then you heard that voice of Paul Bearer saying, "Oh yes," the crowd lost their minds. And then then it followed up with the gong, the Undertaker coming with with the classic Undertaker music. The crowd MSG was chanting Undertaker, as he came back out. That whole moment was another one of those surreal moments. Even though it was not about returning, from an injury, returning from, a long hiatus, a few months. Well, still was quite a few months. It was from November to April, which is still, but the mind games that led up to that moment, and to finally say, hey, the actual Undertaker, in the Dead Man form, has returned to WWE, and he had a long, great run. Ended up having great matches on top of that. Like, he stepped up his game doing his hybrid Undertaker as far as his in-ring ability went. That was a very unique, special moment. There's a lot of people you could have probably put on this list. There's a lot of people that you kind of, that was very special, And there's a lot of other ones I can name for just knowing what that person went through to get back there. Like, I can mention Jake the Snake Roberts' return on Old School Raw one year and put the snake on Dean Ambrose. Knowing that he went through DDP yoga, battled so many times and failed with his addictions, and finally got into a place where he became clean, got himself in great health, lost some weight, was finally happy again. That was a cool moment in itself. Or Scott Hall getting himself right and clean, to the point where he was actually allowed to be brought back to WWE television and go into the Hall of Fame. Those are also those moments that you got to think of as well, that you weren't sure. Another one I want to mention about AEW. Okay, Sting debuting in AEW, which again, when you think about that whole moment of back on TBS and TNT, under the Turner Network, where he was so known for and famous for, key for so many years for WCW. Knowing that he was out of action for so long with a neck injury that nobody ever thought he could wrestle again or take a serious bump, he ended up coming back and having an incredible run with Darby Allin and in AEW, where he was allowed to leave on his own terms, allowed to have one final true run, even though he knew his limitations and he worked around it by having tag matches instead of having singles matches. He knew that he couldn't really do a singles match, even though there were times where he kind of pretty much did, because he was doing, for a while, he felt like he was in a handicap match. And be able to move around as good as he was, knowing his age, and did what he did, was diving off balconies and doing a lot of insane things that you never expect a man in his 60s to do. That was also a very special moment that I will never forget, because I'm a Sting fan as well. So to see that happen, and that's an honorable mention as well, because these are things that you try to rank them. You start thinking more and more as you think about it. But like, that's my list, and I know there's probably more, and I'm sure you, the viewers or listeners, depending on how you get the Rebel by Design Wrestling podcast, um, feel free to leave a comment wherever, and I'll try for a discussion. Uh, we're like obviously on the people who watch it on YouTube, you can leave comments and and let me know what your thoughts and what are your personal favorites or some other ones that you would put on the list. Um, so this is gonna wrap things up for episode number 19. Once again, thank you all for who have listened or watched on YouTube or on any other or any platform that you get the audio version of this podcast. Much appreciated. Please always like and subscribe, and support and give me all your and support. I always very much appreciate it because without you, I would not be here to be able to do this podcast. And it means a lot to me. And hopefully, get a guest out very soon. I know I had a few in the early day episodes, and I'm looking to have more. So, again, please like, subscribe, and follow wherever you get this podcast from, because I do plan on being more frequent with episodes than I have been. I promise it will not be another 2 months before you see episode number 20. So with that being said, everybody have a great rest of your day, week, or month, however long it takes you to get to this episode. Always appreciate and thank you very much, and thank you for listening.